Welcome to episode 116 of Lucretius Today. This is the podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we continue our review of Epicurus's letter to Herodotus, and we move further into fundamental physics. Now let's join Joshua reading today's text.
And these latter are indivisible and unalterable, if, that is, all things are not to be destroyed into the non-existent, but something permanent is to remain behind at the dissolution of compounds. They are completely solid in nature, and can by no means be dissolved in any part. So it must needs be that first beginnings are indivisible corporeal existences. Moreover, the universe is boundless, for that which is bounded has an extreme point, and the extreme point is seen against something else, so that as it has no extreme point, it has no limit, and as it has no limit, it must be boundless and not be bounded. Furthermore, the infinite is boundless both in the number of the bodies and in the extent of the void. For if, on the one hand, the void were boundless, and the bodies limited in number, the bodies could not stay anywhere, but would be carried about and scattered through the infinite void, not having other bodies to support them and keep them in place by means of collisions. But if, on the other hand, the void were limited, the infinite bodies would not have room wherein to take their place. Besides this, the indivisible and solid bodies, out of which too the compounds are created and into which they are dissolved, have an incomprehensible number of varieties in shape. For it is not possible that such great varieties of things should arise from the same atomic shapes if they are limited in number. And so in each shape the atoms are quite infinite in number, but their differences of shape are not quite infinite, but only incomprehensible in number. And the atoms move continuously for all time, some of them falling straight down, others swerving, and others recoiling from their collisions. And of the latter, some are borne on, separating to a long distance from one another, while others again recoil and recoil, whenever they chance to be checked by the interlacing with others, or else shut in by atoms interlaced around them. For on the one hand, the nature of the void which separates each atom by itself brings this about, as it is not able to afford resistance, and on the other hand, the hardness which belongs to the atoms makes them recoil after collision to as great a distance as the interlacing permits separation after the collision. And these motions have no beginning, since the atoms and the void are the cause. These brief sayings, if all these points are borne in mind, afford a sufficient outline for our understanding of the nature of existing things.
Joshua, thank you for reading that for us this morning. We have read this now several weeks and only gone through a short portion of each section. But today we're probably going to speed up and cover all the way from 41 through 45. The material here today strikes me as being some very strict atomism basics with some of the same epistemological points as were raised earlier in the abstract. Now, those epistemological points are still here because we can go through each one of these paragraphs and make observations about the method of reasoning that is involved in it. And actually, that is probably one of the things I would like to see us do the most. Continue to talk about the method of reasoning here, and also continue to talk about how Epicurus was structuring a system that he thought would be understandable. This is, again, a summary written to Herodotus, a system that would be understandable and allow people to have, as he said at the end, a sufficient outline for our understanding of the nature of existing things. In other words, a sort of a general worldview that would be in competition with and replace and assure us that the supernatural worldview in which we could get struck by lightning by a mad god at any moment is not necessary for us to be afraid of. It's certainly not something that we today would consider to be grounds for competing with current physics, although we have lots of observations that people make about the parallels and even the insights that do exist here that have proven to some extent to be true. There are also other aspects of it that we put in an entirely different framework of energy or fields or other ways of looking at things that don't fit into this old hard body model, as Martin has talked about in the past for us. But I think the most productive use of our time, we've already been through this once through the Lucretius podcast, maybe even 2 years ago now, when we went through the details of this in book 1 of Lucretius, because there is more material that is available from the ancient texts, and in book 1 of Lucretius, and maybe to some extent of book 2 as well, these points are elaborated with more detail. So if someone's interested in the physical aspects and the detailed argument of each one, they can find more information about it in the corresponding section of Lucretius. But for our purposes, in terms of going through the letter to Herodotus and talking about an outline of the entire system that relatively non-professional people can use to understand how to live day-to-day life, it's probably better to approach it at a higher level. So obviously I'm inviting whatever you guys think as we go through that you'd like to say. We certainly want to say it. The points here, if we were just listing them again, most of these are included in that list of 12 fundamentals that we have a list of that several different people have come up with over the decades that we can refer to. So apparently Epicurus did think it was useful for people to remember in general certain basic points, such as that the universe is boundless, and it's boundless in the number of bodies and the extent of the void, and that atoms are moving continuously while some are falling straight down and others are not falling straight down. And there's certain things like that in a list that Epicurus thought was critical. So with that as background in what we have here, let's just go through these paragraphs and pick out what we think is the most important takeaway that is still important for a modern person to think about in terms of what point he was making. And so if we go back to 41, the first section, he's starting off by referring to solid bodies as being indivisible and unalterable if all things aren't to be destroyed into non-existent, and that these atoms at this ultimate level are completely solid in nature and cannot be dissolved in any part. So it must needs be that the first beginnings are indivisible, corporeal existences. So who would like to pick part of that out and comment on what they think is important to them? Is this the issue of whether it's possible to walk across a room? This whole issue of infinite divisibility. Most people today, I think, on the street in downtown New York City probably are not thinking about infinite divisibility at any point in time. But at that time, it was a big issue, apparently, between the philosophers. So who wants to pick up the issue of infinite divisibility and why Epicurus rejected it? Don't everyone jump first.
I think there's an interesting analogy here between infinite divisibility and I don't even know if I want to go down this line, but one of the things that is absolutely core to Epicurean physics is an acceptance of a controversial idea. And that controversial idea is the infinite regress of causation. Much of medieval sort of scholastic church logic and theology is based on the idea that an infinite regress of causation is not possible. But in Epicurean philosophy, an infinite regress of causation is not only possible, it is the means by which things happen in nature. They happen as the effect of a cause that was itself the effect of a different cause, and that goes on backwards forever. There's no point at which that wasn't happening, which led, I think, to the condemnation of Epicurean philosophy by people like, Thomas Aquinas, for example, who in his famous 5 proofs of the existence of God, at so much of the core of that was this idea that you can't have an infinite regress of causation, and that there's something about an infinite regress of causation which makes it more objectionable in the mind of people like Thomas Aquinas than the idea that at some point there was a first cause, which you get from Aristotle as well.
Joshua, just to make sure we don't confuse anybody, because of course what you just said is crystal clear, and I do agree with it. What's the difference between this infinite regress of causation, which is a part of Epicurean philosophy, as opposed to the indivisibility of atoms, which Epicurus rejects?
Cassius, as soon as I started that tangent, I thought this is really not irrelevant to anything we're talking
No,
about.
no, I think it's importantly relevant. I think it's very interesting that you brought that up and very helpful because it is an interesting apparent contradiction that people would think about and say, well, Epicurus says there's no first cause, there's no supernatural creating God. Epicurus is saying that the universe itself is boundless and back in time. It's eternal. It had no beginning. So therefore, there is an infinite series of causes extending back infinitely in time. And so he's adopting an infinite regressive cause as a rejection of a first cause. Because if you're going to reject first cause, then you're left with there was no first cause. It's everything's been going on in sequence for an eternity would be his position.
Right. And so the connection there would be that in the view of Epicurus, you cannot have things happening like this for an eternity unless there's a fundamental stability in nature.
Yes.
And that fundamental stability derives from the indivisibility or the uncuttability of the atoms, and that's what the word atom means in Greek. It means uncuttable. And so the view of the Epicureans was if the first beginnings, as they called them, or the seeds of things, if these atoms can be degraded entirely out of existence, then there is no stable foundation for the infinite regress of causation, which is something that I think, as I said, is core to Epicurean physics.
Joshua, I am very glad you went down that road and you did not stop. I think this is very useful for people to think about, and it kind of makes it clear. If you're going to reject a first cause, the logical conclusion of that is that there was no first cause, which means the causes have been extending back into time through infinity. And if that's the case, you still want some mechanism by which these causes have been operating through eternity. And that mechanism through which the causes have gone forward through time, through eternity, that mechanism is these indivisible corporeal existences, the atoms themselves. Obviously, there's no God that's supervising or being the mechanism for this causation, and there must be something else. So that's the importance of atoms. It's not so much a matter of how big they are, or whether in the end we think that there's multiple subatomic particles and the different ways that we today might view atoms from a different perspective. But if we are to reject the idea of a first cause, a lot of people, now maybe not everybody is going to insist or think that they need an explanation for any of this. They're just going to be content with, well, this is the way things are and I'm not going to worry about it. But the idea of a first cause is so deeply rooted in Western philosophy that taking a position on whether there was a first cause is just vital, I would think, to a consistent philosophy. At least it is to me. I'd say this is why atomism remains, for me, a core of my viewpoint of why Epicurus is ultimately correct. Because I can't handle not taking a position on whether there was a first cause. If I think there was a first cause, then I'm going to go into the monastery and devote my life to studying religion and other things that would supposedly illuminate a first cause. But Epicurus is arguing that there's no logical reason to do that, that it makes perfect sense that there be that infinite regression of causes without a first cause based on atomism as the mechanism. Martin, it's your turn.
I agree that this makes that ancient metaphysics then consistent.
Joshua?
There's a very sort of notable story or joke in the physics community, which Martin will certainly be familiar with, I think, which is the story of the scientist giving a lecture on physics, and an elderly Indian woman comes up to him afterwards and says, everything you've been saying is wrong. Everyone knows that the Earth actually sits on the back of 4 elephants, and the 4 elephants stand on the back of a giant turtle. And the scientist sees an opening, and he says, "Well, what does the turtle sit on?" And the lady says, "You're very clever, sir, but its turtle's all the way down."
Yeah, taken on a life of its own on the internet. I think I see that all the time. Turtles all the way down.
It really has, yeah. So I think the key issue about atomism, and the thing we have to understand about the text that we're reading right now, is that if atomism started with Democritus or Leucippus, we don't have surviving works from either of those guys. And so this letter that we're reading right now, this is sort of the text for atomism in the ancient world. I think it's probably the oldest surviving text on atomism from the ancient world. And so what we're really dealing with here is what George Santayana called the greatest idea that mankind has ever hit upon, which is the idea of atomism, of atoms and void, and that the atoms are eternal and the void is infinite. And
can you spell the name of that? Because for that quote for quite some time. So can you spell that name?
Yeah. It's George Santayana, who was a Harvard-educated philosopher, actually, and taught at Harvard. Santayana. He put this in a book which he wrote called Three Philosophical Poets, in which he compared Lucretius and I think probably Dante and Milton, maybe. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, but I don't know who the other two were. And certainly the longest portion of his book is dedicated to Lucretius, which I think George Santayana had an affinity in particular for Epicurean physics. But so maybe we should talk about that. And we've been talking about it a little bit, but what is it about atomism that makes it such a powerful understanding of physics for philosophy? Even if, as you say, Cassius, there are some things that don't quite match the way science sees things now. And I know you don't want to go down that road, but what is it philosophically about atomism that makes it so powerful? Is it just what we've been talking about infinite regress and how it cuts off any possibility for an end run by religion?
I think that's a large part of it. That's exactly the question I'd like us to focus on, though, Joshua. If you already have a proposed answer to it, please go ahead. Do you see other major factors about it that would merit George Santayana or people taking that position that it is so profoundly important? Because we don't ordinarily think of it that way anymore. We think of it as sort of a technical observation, and we get involved in the details of how it works and so forth. I think without keeping at the top of our minds what the significance of it is. And I'll say this again, I think part of the reason for that is that it's one of these issues where we've kind of gotten jaded a little bit. We have learned so much about the details that we now are familiar with the topic, and we realize that we've learned a lot. We have a lot more to learn, but we don't anymore think as much about the implications of it, I think, as they did back then, because they were, I guess, faced so closely with this immediacy of religion that had permeated all of society. It was a different religion than we have today, but everybody was used to, that's a large part of the history of mankind discussed in Lucretius, is how primitive peoples were looking for answers to things and came up with supernatural religion as the way to explain these questions that they could not answer. And atomism as an approach is probably the ultimate alternative to supernatural explanations for the universe. And of course, in that sense, atomism would have to be interpreted very broadly. But looking for these causes in the elements in nature, it has tremendous implications for a person's worldview. I mean, one of the things that I'm always taken back to because of my religious upbringing was the phrase in the New Testament. I think it was Paul accusing the different Greeks or the non-Christians of being the slaves of the weak and beggarly elements, as the words that are in the King James Version, which is what I was always taught. And I think ultimately that's the level of issue we're talking about here, is that people who are not willing to accept a natural explanation for the universe consider these atoms that we're talking about to be gods of their own. They think that there's no way to analyze anything except in terms of supernatural powers. And they think, well, then you're just transferring supernatural power from Jehovah to the atoms or to dirt. And they ridicule that as an approach. And so I'm rambling now, but yeah, I think this is really the issue that we have to grapple with. You have more to add to that? Because you're going strong this morning, so keep going.
Well, I do, because I think you've hit upon something that we tend to overlook, which is that atomism has teeth. It really does. It's not just philosophically powerful, but it presents an amazing challenge to the established authorities of religion. And not just in the ancient world, but as late as 1874, where John Tyndall gave his Belfast Address, in which he outlines not merely an argument for a scientific approach to the study of nature, but to a materialist understanding of nature. and which he bases on Epicurus and Lucretius in particular. And the evidence of the teeth of atomism is the sheer outrage that was caused by this address and the backlash that he received for it, again, as late as 1874. So it really does present a tremendous challenge to the worldview of creation or design, because it sort of, in my view, it just short circuits the requirement, Because Thomas Aquinas, who I mentioned earlier, when you look at his logical syllogisms for his proofs of the existence of God, what he ends up doing in that case is affirming the consequent. He assumes what he has not proved, which is, and actually he contradicts his premise too in his conclusion. He says that things have causes, that there cannot be an infinite regress of causation, therefore there is a first cause, an uncaused cause. Well, his first premise is everything has a cause, and his conclusion is there's something that didn't have a cause. So atomism just skips right through all the BS surrounding this question, and it does it in a way that, as I say, it's tremendously powerful. It has great explanatory power.
Yes. So now to add to physics point, no? So this is also in physics the case. So that from a phenomenological standpoint, you can make continuum theories about a lot of things. So then you have empirical constants, which then describes this. But you don't come down to a mechanistic description. Something very simple as a phase transition from one phase to another, or why there is anything else than just a uniform solid body or a uniform fluid. So anything then a transition from this, trying to describe this mechanistically, is very difficult because without referring to a smallest unit which still behaves like that substance. No? So and if you go divide it further, it becomes something else. No? So we don't even need to go to something which is uncuttable. It's just if you cut it further, it's no more what you're talking about. Then it's something completely else and does no more contribute what you were looking at. No? And then things like overheating or undercooling in a continuum theory, you don't have a mechanistic explanation how that can happen. And with an atomistic theory, it's easy to come to that, or relatively easy to come up with qualitative models which do that. And you can refer them back to primary principles, and you are not just rely on empirical constants only, but on factors which you can calculate on a small set of fundamental constants. And I think this explanatory power in physics, this also translates into being powerful in philosophy.
Right. I think I see what you mean. So as opposed to a mechanistic universe, you're dealing with something like a probabilistic universe. Would that be an appropriate way to describe it, or how do you feel about that?
And that would be another aspect. So I didn't mean that one, but that one would fit in as well. So that if we go then either into thermodynamics or into quantum theory, then we come to the need to have a probabilistic description. But I wasn't pointing on this one. I was pointing towards a mechanistic explanation on the phenomena, and that a lot of effects fundamentally need this atomism to get an conceptually easily understandable explanation, and continuum theories just do not provide that. They have their place. In a lot of things, we use continuum theories in physics, but when we come down to really, we want to know what's happening at the smallest portion, so to say, and then also explain some of the phenomena we get. Atomism can explain it, and continuum theories alone cannot. So the continuum theory don't have explanatory powers. They can be used as engineering tools, but they don't provide explanatory power.
I don't know how far down that line we want to go, but I do want to go far enough to connect what you just said, Martin, when you talk about continuum theory. That also had its parallels in the ancient viewpoints, right? Wasn't there a plenum issue even in the ancient philosophies? Do you know who was associated with that? Or maybe we won't go too far down that at all if we're not able to, because I know I'm not able to. I just thought that there are parallels in the ancient world. Isn't the word plenum associated with somebody? I don't know.
I'm not familiar with the equivalent. analog to continuum theory. So I'm just coming from a rather recent physics standpoint.
Joshua, do you know, or?
Well, it actually bears on what something I brought up last week, I think, which is, but plenum is a space completely filled with matter. So it's, there's no void in a plenum. And the argument was made, and the Epicureans, I think, supported the argument that in a plenum, motion would be impossible. And we observe motion, therefore we can't be in a plenum. But the counter argument was made that as long as the objects or bodies in the plenum move simultaneously, you can still have motion without a void. But like a fish.
Yeah, you add compressibility to the continuum, and it works as well. I mean, maybe you can look at the slow motion picture. If someone gets hit by a fist or a ball, his face strongly deforms. And this shows it at a phenomenological level that things can be deformed temporarily. And then if you are not very unlucky, it springs back in form.
I think that even that argument is mentioned in Lucretius as well, but I don't have enough recollection to talk about it. Martin, let me ask you this. Does the continuum argument, as far as you know, does it have any implication for whether there was a first cause or not? I think you referenced the issue of the question of why there is something rather than nothing. Probably the takeaway of all of the science is that we're taking the position that science is leading us to a conclusion that a supernatural first cause is not necessary to explain how we get here. Can you summarize the position of what you're familiar with in modern physics as to whether it takes a position about a supernatural first cause?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we are modern physics is agnostic on this one. So whether there is something supernatural which has made the world into this or not, it's completely irrelevant. So we provide a natural explanation for things which doesn't need the supernatural instances, but we don't derive there's anything conclusive, the level of conclusiveness of science itself on supernatural or not. So this is then what we do here in philosophy, that we draw this conclusion that there is, because we don't need it for anything to explain. So that means why come up with supernatural?
I think Epicurus would answer your question, we don't need it for anything. He'd say, of course you need it in order to live a happy life. And of course, that's outside the bounds of what you're suggesting that the scientists are really talking about. But I think that is the big difference with Epicurean physics versus modern physics, is that you use the word agnostic. I think it's a great word. Modern physics does not go campaigning, it seems like, although individual modern physicists certainly do campaign on these issues. Modern physics as a science doesn't seem to want to go in the full direction that Epicurus went, to applying these conclusions to whether certain religions can be correct or not. It stays out of those fights, it seems like, where Epicurus waded right in and saw it, in fact, to some degree, as a large reason for what he was doing. In order to live happily, he wanted an explanation. He wasn't just looking for an explanation in order for its own sake. Why don't I promise we're going to try to move faster today. Let's see if I can suggest that we move forward to this point, and I hope this doesn't bog us down further. But I think it's worthwhile commenting on 42. Moreover, the universe is boundless, for that which is bounded has an extreme point, and the extreme point is seen against something else, so that as it has no extreme point, it has no limit. And as it has no limit, it must be boundless and not bounded. Now, I want to know if you guys agree with me. That strikes me as just an absolutely logic-based argument based on definitions. It's not even really physics. It's just definitions. Does that strike you guys that way?
Yeah, he sometimes makes something. He shows something what is self-consistent. No? So it's not really proving anything other than that this thing is self-consistent.
I mean, it's almost like the definition of boundless is that it does not have an extreme point, because that's the definition of the word bounded. And it is linked to an observation, because he says the extreme point is seen against something else. Maybe that's a point I should be making, is that we're making not only a logical point, but we're linking it to a verification through the senses. But maybe I'm just reversing my course even as I speak here. I think maybe this is just an example of a combination of a logic argument and a sensation-based argument backing it up. Joshua, you're the person in the middle. Go ahead.
There's also a sense here in which he's sort of beginning by just defining his terms, which is often an excellent starting place for explaining anything. Explaining not just what boundless means, but the implications of it is, I think, a fair place to start if you're going to then go on to say the universe, the infinite is boundless, both in the number of the bodies and in the extent of the void. But I certainly see what you mean. He's not giving the classic example of not really sense perception on this question, but thought experiment is the javelin thrower standing at the edge of the universe. I think, does that come from Lucretius?
I believe that would be in this parallel section of Lucretius under the heading of what we're talking about now. So I think it's exactly parallel. Yes, it is in
So
Lucretius.
In that sense, you're taking the sense perception of watching what happens when you throw a javelin and it hits something solid or it doesn't hit something solid. And then based on that, you're arguing by analogy, by way of a thought experiment, to what would happen if you stood at the edge of the universe or at the edge of the cosmos and threw a javelin. And either it hits something, in which case there's body outside the universe, or it doesn't hit anything and it keeps on going, in which case there's void beyond what we had assumed to be the limit of the universe.
Martin, any comment on that one?
Yeah, it's good. It's nice.
All right. Then help me, guys, as we go through the rest here, because I'm not sure that in looking through the rest of it, it's obviously all very important, and we have a list of them. But let's just say 42. The infinite is boundless both in the number of bodies and in the extent of the void. So he's saying that not only is it boundless in extent in terms of space, it's also boundless in the number of bodies that it contains. And his explanation, of course, is that you sort of have to have both of those to be true for everything to be in balance. Otherwise, either the space would take over from the bodies or the bodies would take over from the space.
Not just for everything to be in balance, but for things to match the observable universe that we do see in every day.
Right.
So his view is that you don't get something like a tree if all the atoms that would go into making a tree are scattered over 10 million light years of space. They have to come together in a space to do that. And in order to do that, there have to be a sufficient number of atoms in any given volume of space for them to have even the remotest chance of coming together. And an infinite void with a finite number of bodies means that they scatter, the distance between the atoms just gets further and further apart as you go on in time.
Joshua, here's an easy question for you. Is there a difference between infinite and boundless?
Well, no, not really, no.
Martin, is there a difference between?
No difference.
Okay, all right.
No difference.
I agree with that, I'm pretty sure. But what I wanted to pin down was this implication that boundless means uncountable, basically. Is that correct?
Well, boundless literally means without a boundary, and infinite. Right. Infinite comes from the Latin, which means literally without an end. So
that I don't want to get into a discussion of real versus unreal numbers or other higher concepts that I don't even know how to talk about. But
please, I failed algebra class.
I bet you guys know the point I'm trying to make, though. Help me make it. The word infinite does not imply some kind of a mystical thing. You can't count them because of your limitations of your sensations and your lifetime and things like that. It's not like there's new things being brought into existence every moment, which is why they're infinite, or that says some God that's creating them every moment. They actually do exist. Even though the number of them is uncountable, they do actually exist in the present moment. Is that correct?
In the ancient philosophy, yes.
Yeah, you're going to tempt me to go into a long tangent about how the moderns would say something different. But at least let's stay with ancient philosophy, or maybe common sense without quantum mechanics. Joshua.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, particularly in terms of space, my day job is to take very large measurements using very precise equipment. But on any given line that you take, that line just goes out infinitely in that direction. And there's I guess I don't really know how to answer the question because.
Well, do you know where I'm going, though, with the concern? I think some people have a concern maybe that describing something as infinite is just what you're going to describe God as if by designating it as infinite, you have somehow invested it with an attribute of supernatural quality.
Okay, I see and in Plato, the Platonic dialogues, you've got the argument that pleasure can't be the highest good because pleasure has no limit, and something that has no limit can't be perceived as the good. That kind of argument.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So the basic point before we lose it would be that he uses words that we would translate as infinite, but he's equating the infinite with boundless and limited in number versus unlimited in number, but not implying that they are obviously coming into existence or going out of existence, because he's already established that things don't do that, I guess.
Right. So it is interesting to me because I think I've written before that this idea of boundaries tends to come up quite a lot in Epicurean philosophy. In Lucretius, you've got that sort of paean to Epicurus in which he said that he, traversed the flaming ramparts of the world and brought back news of what can be and what cannot. And then he says, the boundary stone set forever. So there is an extent in which Epicurean philosophy, the project of Epicurean philosophy, not as a means to pursue happiness, but as a method of inquiry, is to find out about boundaries, boundaries on, the limits of pleasure, for example, and boundaries on the involvement of the gods in human affairs, and boundaries on the size of the universe, and that kind of thing. So the issue does come up quite a lot about boundaries or the lack of boundaries.
And to some extent, probably one of the reasons for that, which is what you're saying, is that we do want to, if we can, have confidence in ruling out certain things that threaten our happiness, such as an idea that there's capricious gods supernaturally controlling our fate. And that would be something that's outside the bounds of our understanding of the nature of the universe. I would say that's one application of the boundary aspect.
Right, yeah.
One of the reasons I articulated a poorly formed question there was in the next sentence, the word that jumps out at me as interesting is incomprehensible, because in the next paragraph, when he starts talking about the number of varieties of shape, he calls the number of varieties of shape incomprehensible in number. And of course, I always hate to put too much emphasis on a single word. I don't know what the Greek was here. I don't know how other people translate that word and whether it's something that perhaps has another English word that's better for it. But what about the idea of an incomprehensible number of varieties in shape? Because he's saying that they are limited in number. So the varieties in shape are incomprehensible in number, but they're differences in shape are not quite infinite. I may have read that wrong as I was reading it the first time, but the last sentence states it clearly. So in each shape, the number of atoms is infinite in number, but the differences of shape are not quite infinite, but only incomprehensible.
Right, which Lucretius makes the comparison between the atoms and the building blocks of language, which doesn't quite work when your language only has 26 letters in the alphabet, because 26 is not a number that's incomprehensible. But I think of language like, for example, classical Chinese and the amazing variety of characters that you can use to express thought. I read a story once about he was a professor of the Chinese language at a major Chinese university. And he asked a number of Chinese graduate students who had, chosen to study this language in a postgraduate setting. And he asked them if they could give the Chinese ideogram for the word sneeze. And not a single one of them could do it. So that's the kind of language where you do have just an amazing variety of characters. And it's the case that not any one person knows all of them. So if I was going to try to take Lucretius's analogy between the shapes of the atoms and the letters of the alphabet, I would have to reach for not an alphabet, but something like Chinese ideograms in order to come up with a set of numbers large enough. But an indiscrete set, because we don't know how many there are. Probably used the word discrete incorrectly. I'll have to ask Martin about that one.
I want to hear what Martin has to say too, but let me say this and try to set Martin up for this question. And I may be wrong about what I'm about to say, but I'm thinking I remember in Lucretius or reading some commentator that in terms of this incomprehensibility issue, there's a related issue or a sub-issue of one of the reasons we know that the number of shapes of atoms is not infinite is because, and this is where I seem to remember that the word size gets into the equation, because it's either in Lucretius or somebody I've read has suggested that the reason we know that the number of shapes are not infinite is because there's no shape that is so large that it is visible to us as a single atom, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why this is incomprehensible, because it's incomprehensible to us to imagine an atom so large that we can see it or touch it or feel it, because that's just not our experience. I may be totally wrong in throwing that out there, but I'm going to leave it probably. Have you read that?
I have read that, yeah.
Okay.
I think you're absolutely right about that.
I'm concerned about the blending of the word shape and size together. But Martin, any thoughts on that?
We have a problem here. There are contradictions between the. So Bailey's tradition contradicts itself. Hicks' translation looks okay, and Younger has also the same problem as the Bailey translation, and the German translation by Kautz makes sense as well, because it goes along the line of Hicks. Because here, in that last part of this sentence, if they are limited in number, that clearly says that in the Bailey translation, the number of different shapes is infinite, and that doesn't match the other translation. It doesn't fit to the overall meaning. It's just that we don't know the number of at that time. Aber jetzt within that ancient physics, we do not know the number of different shapes of these atoms, and that's why that number is incomprehensible. But from those translations which make sense, it is expected that this number is finite. Because we can again use this same argument he uses here. What we see is a great variety of things, but not an infinite number of things. So it means we don't need an infinite number of atoms, of different shapes in atoms.
Thank you for pointing that out, Martin. The translations are different. And this is probably a time, I probably should have mentioned this earlier. When you compare Hicks and Young, it looks like Bailey is removing the parenthetical expressions that are in the original text, or in what we have as the original text. In trying to compare sections 42 and 43, when you look at the Hicks version or the Young version, those contain the parenthetical expressions, such as, for neither does the divisibility go on ad infinitum, he says below, but he adds, since the qualities change, unless one is prepared to keep enlarging their magnitudes, also simply ad infinitum. Maybe that's where I got that, enlarging their magnitudes. So we've been reading Bailey. That's one of the downfalls of using only a single translation, is we're not getting the parenthetical expressions. So, of course, the parenthetical expressions are not necessarily Epicurus. So it's a trade-off.
Because I run into this with another issue in 43, there's an important thing about to know what these expressions in parentheses, what are the sources of those?
I think that these exist in the current versions of Diogenes Laertius, and that certain sections are obviously added on by commentators over the centuries. For example, when it clearly says something like, he says below, or he adds, or something like that, it's clearly not a part of the original letter. So these comments are ancient in origin, apparently, but who knows whether they are by Diogenes Laertius or by somebody else, and by an Epicurean or not. A different level of reliability comes into play.
Yeah, but how do we know that these are in parent? I still don't get it. How do we know that these are different? How to say this? So that we have a part of the text which is original Epicurus, and there is this part which is not. So how do we distinguish this part?
Now, Joshua, correct me on this, but I think it's all a matter of textual criticism, right, Joshua? They're just going into the details of what's there and analyzing it with a microscope and looking at how the text is written and so forth.
Right. There is a certain sense in which, a parentheses is sort of a modern convenience of punctuation, but that they may have had, for example, grammar, different grammar rules that might set off an idea as being different from the stream of ideas around it. And so the modern convention would be to put that idea into parentheses. That most ancient Greek texts were actually, the way they were written in ancient Greece was you had a continuous stream of capital letters with no spaces and no punctuation marks. So that's how they wrote. They didn't, this idea of that we could write in a way that is very clear and very legible and with different things set off and demarcated and delimited is a relatively modern convenience. It didn't exist in the ancient world, really.
I think in Latin inscriptions they at least use spaces.
Yeah, this is more in ancient Greek that I'm talking about, and I don't even know if it was true of all ancient Greek either. But it's certainly the case is not necessarily straightforward that we're going to always understand it. There is that case in Lucretius of immediately after he goes into, you've got the hymn to Venus, you've got the sort of the praise of Epicurus, and you've got the criticism of religion. And then he follows the criticism of religion immediately with the passage saying that if the gods, if they exist, must exist in a state of quiet peace or something to that effect. The argument that is often made is that there's a conflict between that passage and the hymn to Venus and his invocation of the muse of Venus to help him in his writing, and to say that, well, you can't ask for Venus, ask for her help over here, and then over here immediately afterwards say, that the gods don't interfere in human affairs. So the argument is made that passage, which is reproduced identically later on in the poem, the argument is that passage was quoted in the margins of a manuscript by a scribe who was copying the poem, who had gotten that far and said, oh, now wait a minute. At the beginning we had this, and now I'm reading over here that the gods don't interfere and they exist in the state of eternal bliss, removed from human affairs. So he copied it over as if to show that there was something wrong here, that there was a contradiction in the philosophy. So the argument is made that this was an interpolation from a later scribe, but of course it's not possible to actually know the answer to that question, which I suspect is true for quite a lot of textual criticism.
Where we're a little late in the sequence of going through the literature of Herodotus to make this observation. Probably we've missed some commentary already because we've been sticking with the Bailey version. But I guess in defense of Bailey, if you want to know what Epicurus said in his letter to Herodotus, you stick with what Epicurus said and you eliminate the interpolations. So I guess maybe the warning to us would be as we go through the difficult sections I think especially in this letter to Herodotus and maybe the letter to Pythocles, we see these things occurring more than in some other sections. I don't know that I remember that there's that much in the letter to Menorchius that would have these in it, but now that we're talking about it, there seem to be a lot of them in the physics sections of the letter to Herodotus and Pythocles. So we'll just have to be alert for that and look for them and try to factor them in the discussion, but probably just still stick with Bailey on the grounds that we want to know what Epicurus said and not so much what the commentators said.
But just an important question to Joshua to really clarify this one. So I know from experience with both Thai and Japanese language that you can write down even a fairly long sentence without any space in between, without any comma, just as one word, and you can still understand it as one sentence. But you separate different sentences from each other. And I would expect the same thing would be needed for ancient Greek, so that at least the sentences will be separated in some way that you know where one sentence ends and the other one starts.
Right. I am so far from being an expert on the orthography of ancient Greek that I really couldn't answer that question.
Okay. What I'm talking about. Actually, I have a book here where I have somewhere. I will check this out later. I think I should have somewhere a book where I have the Greek version. Yeah, but okay, the spaces that may have been added later. So now when I open this up, I see the Greek with spaces between words.
Right. So go to the Wikipedia page. It's called Scriptio Continua. Scriptio Continua is a style of writing without spaces or other marks between the words or sentences. Also lacks punctuation, diacritics, or distinguishing letter case. So it was all in capitals. In the West, the oldest Greek and Latin inscriptions used word dividers to separate words and sentences. However, classical Greek and late classical Latin both employed Scriptio Continua as the norm. That is not the progression that I would expect. They started with word dividers and then abandoned them at some point. That's very unusual.
It makes no sense, yeah.
Yeah.
This is a really interesting subject, and probably we ought to find a way to start a thread or a section at the forum to deal with this, because it obviously is critically important for our understanding of the text. And one of the ways it jumps into the most high-level view of all this is the principal doctrines. We always refer to them as 40, and we segment them up into 40. But apparently that 40 did not exist in the original text. And when you read it all as a narrative paragraph, it comes across differently than when you separate it out with what may be an undue emphasis on just whoever chose to make those divisions has inserted their thought process into what we're taking today as gospel from Epicurus. So we really need to devote some time to thinking about the textual ramifications of what we're talking about now.
Right. Now, so much of how we write sentences today is derived from the humanist scholars of the Carolingian Renaissance, and then after them, the scholars of the Italian Renaissance. So, for example, Poggio Bracciolini, who was the book hunter and papal bureaucrat who discovered Lucretius's lost poem in a monastery in Germany, was known for having very beautiful handwriting, and it's from him and people like him that we derive lowercase letters. They didn't use lowercase letters in the ancient world. So this is another modern convention.
This is something that I'm not sure is very well developed out there in normal writing on philosophy like this. That needs to be developed further. And I know one reason it has a direct impact on a lot of people. Again, I always consider myself to be the average person, which is a very fallacious thing to do. But what's one of the things that a lot of people who are brought up in standard Christianity, what's one of the first things that I think a lot of people understand to be, hey, I better step back and not take all this on faith, is when they realize that the Bible that we have today is such a compilation of people over centuries who've made decisions about what books to include, what not to include, how to read a particular section, how to divide it up, how to translate it. All these issues of translation and transmission was, in my case anyway, one of the first awakenings I had that there's more to be understood here than meets the eye. And so getting people acclimated with the difficulties of transmitting text and understanding them is pretty important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have to tell one of my favorite stories now. There was an early American businessman born in 1747. His name was Timothy Dexter, and he kind of had the reputation for being kind of a boob who just sort of lucked into wealth and power and all that. But he had very little schooling and couldn't really read or write very well. And he wrote a book called A Pickle for the Knowing Ones, which is a very strange book. It's sort of his memoir. But in this book, there was not a single punctuation mark anywhere in it. And so he, in the first edition, and so the publisher got so many complaints from people. It was a bestseller. I mean, this was one of the most popular books in the era before the revolution. And the publisher got so many complaints from this book that in the second edition, Timothy Dexter wrote a little paragraph that said, people are having trouble reading this, so I've given you 2 pages of punctuation marks, and you can salt and pepper them as you please. And he just tacked that onto the end of the book.
I've never heard that story. That's very interesting.
Oh yeah.
Now I'm beginning to look at the clock a little bit and decide how much more time to put into the rest of what we've cut out for today, because the issue of motion is going to come up next. I might as well go ahead and make this comment on 43. It's always been my understanding, even though Bailey here is translating the atoms move continuously, some of them falling straight down, others swerving. It's always been my understanding that use of the word swerve there is not the same as what's contained in Lucretius, because I've always read many people say that the swerve does not appear in Epicurean texts anywhere other than Lucretius. Maybe it appears in later writings, but I've heard people say it doesn't appear in Epicurus. Is that correct from what you guys understand?
It's not in the extant text, so it's pretty sure it was in there in those lost texts, but in the preserved texts not. And this surprised me now to see here. But we also have here then this issue that different translations don't have it. This is now a case where Bailey has the thing in parentheses and the others don't have it, or at least one of the others doesn't have it. So now it's the other way around, that Bailey has an addition which others don't have.
Right. You said something I need to comment on, and I've already forgotten what you said.
He said that it doesn't exist.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I did not mean to imply that Lucretius came up with it himself. Absolutely right. It clearly dates to Epicurus, but I've seen people say that it doesn't survive in the text except through Lucretius. That's the point. Thank you, Joshua. Yes.
Right. And the further point being that in Democritus's physical universe, as one of the founders or co-founders of atomism, his universe really was mechanistic, and not simply mechanistic, but the implication of being mechanistic is that it was deterministic, and there was no room for free will. So that's a huge part of Epicurus's version of atomism, is there has to be room left for free will.
Exactly. And that's what I was debating with myself as to how far we go down the road of discussing free will today.
I mean, it doesn't show up here, so it just mentions this word without talking in detail. And plus, the German translation doesn't even refer to this as verb, and it uses a word which is more like drifting, and that is different. So that means where swerve really has this meaning of change in direction. Drifting doesn't have the meaning.
Right.
And so that means there's another discrepancy in the translation. So probably this refers to that what is meant in this portion for paragraph 43 does not use the word for what was then used for the actual swerve with which Epicurus came up. So in that sense, that means the swerve wasn't mentioned, probably.
Well, having made those comments then and sort of ruled out discussing determinism for today, maybe we can plow through. What's the highlight of potentially 43 and 44? We're talking about motion now. He's laid out in 43 the types of motion. And then in 44, he said that the motion has no beginning, since the atom and void are the cause. Is there anything really important in 43 and 44 other than the issue of motion being something that's eternally been going on?
Yes, there is, and it's one of the thorniest issues in Epicurean physics, and it's one that I continually struggle with, even trying to understand in the context of Epicurean physics. And it's this idea of atoms falling straight down. What does it mean for atoms to fall straight down? Obviously, what they lacked in the ancient world was any sense of gravity as a force for attraction between bodies. And so no matter which physical system you look at, you have to somehow account for the fact that if I push a book off a table, it doesn't just float in midair, it actually falls to the ground. And the various ideas that people had for how to explain that. Aristotle, for example, thought that the center of the earth was the center of the universe, and the natural tendency of things was to go toward the center. Well, actually, that's even more complicated slightly, because the natural tendency of dense bodies was to go toward the center, and the natural tendency of lighter bodies was to go away from the center. And then on the very outside, you've got the ether. You'll see the script of Epicurean physics in which they say that originally the atoms were falling straight down, and then you had to have the swerve in order to get them to start colliding with one another to set them off. That, to me, is the most fundamental contradiction, because there is no original state in Epicurean physics. There's no time when things were just first starting to happen. They've always been happening.
Right.
And so this issue of the reign of atoms, as it's sometimes called, to me is very odd and very strange and very confusing. But it's really all I have to say about it.
The thing I would say about it is it seems to me that he had a pretty clear playing field where he had already affirmed or was strongly affirming that the universe is boundless in all directions. So there's nothing at the bottom, or from whatever orientation we're looking at, there's nothing below us that would be attracting. But then on the other hand, he can observe here on Earth that everything does seem to fall downward. And I guess when you combine those two observations, you simply have to start with the presumption that everything is constantly falling in a particular direction. I guess you don't see things falling in other directions besides what we would consider to be downward. So I agree with you that it's very difficult to unwind it. Go ahead.
But this is not correct. If you look up the sky and see the movement there, it goes in circles.
Or sideways. The clouds go sideways. Whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, as I say, it's tremendously confusing. It's confusing because, as I said, there's no original state. It's also confusing because there's no center to the universe, and it's difficult to understand why there should be a particular favored frame of reference, and to say that, there's no center and there's no limit, but for some reason we know that that way is down, and that the natural tendency of bodies is to go down.
And this,
but of course,
seems to be a genuine inconsistency in the Epicurean physics.
It is, and there's no way to get around it when there's no theory of gravity, because gravity is really sort of the linchpin of modern physics. I hope I'm not going too far in saying that, but when there's no understanding of gravity as a force that moves bodies, there's simply no way to get around this problem, unless you take the Aristotelian view that the universe has a center, and that the tendency of bodies is to fall toward the center, which is the center of the earth.
Regardless of how you unwind that, I agree with the direction you're taking, Joshua, that you've got to start with some of the premises that you've previously reached, that there was no original state, that nothing has changed since the beginning of time. If we even consider there to be a beginning of time, nothing has ever changed about the way things are as a whole. So you have to take that as a starting point, I would think, of his thought. And there is more detail in Lucretius about even this section as well, but it's not satisfying, I think, is your point. And it's I'm not satisfied with it either and can't explain it either. But if in my hypothetical kindergarten I was being asked this question by some child, I guess that's the direction I would go in, is that it's very difficult to understand, but there are certain things you have to take as a given, which is that there was no beginning to the universe, which means that whatever's been happening has been happening eternally. And you're taking as a given also in Epicurean philosophy anyway, that there's no center, there's no limit downward to the universe. So there's nothing, even if you think everything is falling in a particular direction, there's nothing that is really attracting it to itself, or no direction that they're going in other than what we can observe as humans. So it's difficult or impossible to sort all that out. But don't worry, Joshua, because these brief sayings, if all these points are brought in mind, afford a sufficient outline for our understanding of the nature of existing things.
That is a great summary of this passage, and also a good reminder that what we're dealing with here is, as we talked about in the very first episode, what we're dealing with here is an outline of the Epicurean conception of nature. And if you want to read everything he had to say about nature, you're going to need a time machine, because so much of it is irrevocably lost forever.
And when you come to a position like we came to on discussing the atoms falling through the void eternally, you can take the position that there's a lot more to understand about that than meets the eye, and that we have the ability to unwind right now. And you can wait, as is discussed in Diogenes Laertius, that Epicurus suggested that when we don't have enough information, we wait before we take an arbitrary position as to what the right answer is. And we can move on with our lives and attempt to live them happily, or else we can go off and decide that Jehovah's got a better answer. And as far as I'm concerned, Jehovah does not have a better answer, or at least those who advocate for Jehovah don't have a more satisfactory answer than does Epicurus about the nature. So that's the kind of question that he's posing that each person has to decide for themselves. Okay, we probably are near the end of a normal episode. So, Martin, what are your final thoughts for the day?
Well, I just have an addition here. What I found in the, so it doesn't talk about downwards movement, perpendicular path. Yeah. So instead of the downward movement, the German translation here gives what is there in the parenthesis. It's moving on a perpendicular path.
Perpendicular to what?
Yeah. Doesn't say to what. That's the same thing with that is and the same thing with it. So it doesn't really resolve the issue with that we have there's some sort of a reference direction at least, or something, without that we have anything to pinpoint it to. So it means the contradiction is not really removed, but it doesn't have this down.
Anything else as a closing thought for today?
No.
Okay. Joshua.
No, I don't think I do. I think we've done a pretty good job here, I hope, of getting beyond just the physics into the implications of the physics, but some things are going to remain inexplicable, which I think maybe the key thing to end with is that this issue of falling down, it's not as if when the theory of gravity was formulated that this was a death knell for for Epicurean philosophy. There's no reason it can't keep going strong with an understanding of a materialist universe, even with a changing idea about how that universe operates.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. Are you finished?
I am finished. Yep.
Okay.
I'll have more for you next week.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, that's a good place for us all to stop, because we're going to take the material that we've just gone through and we're going to apply that to all sorts of questions over the next several weeks in terms of how our sensations work and how many worlds like ours there may or may not exist in the rest of the universe, and all sorts of other questions that we're going to take these building blocks that we've been discussing over the last several weeks and apply them to practical questions. So we'll do that beginning next week. And hearing nothing else, I thank you for your time today, and we'll come back next week.
I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Good night.
bye.